The cut crystal water glass, heavy as a paperweight, felt slick in Arthur Vance's hand. At 72, his grip wasn't what it used to be, but the tremor that ran through his fingers had nothing to do with age. It was a vibration of the soul, a low hum of wrongness that had settled over him the moment he'd stepped into the gilded cage. For 5 decades, he had built Vance Industries from a garage workshop into a global tech behemoth, a fortress of innovation protected by patents and firewalls. He'd navigated hostile takeovers that were little more than back-alley brawls in $1,000 suits and had stared down corporate raiders with the cold, unblinking eyes of a predator. Yet, in this hushed sanctuary of old money and older secrets, seated in his usual corner booth upholstered in blood-red leather, he felt a vulnerability he hadn't known since he was a boy. The restaurant was his place, a bastion of discretion, where the clinking of Christoffel silverware against Bernardaud porcelain was the loudest sound, and the conversations were murmurs of power, insulated by acres of mahogany and velvet. The air, usually thick with the comforting sense of butter-basted steak and vintage Bordeaux, tonight felt thin and charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. The pianist in the corner, a man whose grandfather had played for Arthur's father, seemed to be striking the keys with a little too much force, the familiar melodies of Gershwin sounding less like nostalgia and more like a warning. He was here to meet Julian Croft. The name left a taste like rust in his mouth. Julian, his former protégé. The brilliant, ambitious young man he'd plucked from obscurity, molded and trusted like a son. The same young man who had tried to gut his company from the inside out 3 years ago, a failed corporate coup that had been both professionally devastating and personally heartbreaking. Julian had requested this meeting, speaking of reconciliation, of making amends. Arthur, against the strident advice of his board and his own better judgment, had agreed. Perhaps it was a fool's hope for closure, a desire to understand the why that had haunted his sleepless nights. A young woman approached his table, her movements a study in practiced efficiency. She was a waitress, perhaps 20 or 21, with dark, serious eyes that seemed too old for her face. Her uniform, a crisp white shirt and black trousers, was immaculate, but Arthur, a man who had built his empire on noticing the details others missed, saw the faint fraying at her cuffs and the worn soles of her sensible shoes. He saw the fatigue etched around her eyes, the kind that comes not from one long shift, but from a lifetime of them. She wasn't looking at him. Not really. Her gaze kept flicking towards the bar, where 2 men in impeccably tailored suits had taken seats moments after Julian's arrival. They were trying to look casual, nursing glasses of scotch, but their stillness was predatory. They weren't enjoying the ambiance, they were observing it, mapping it. Julian Croft, seated opposite Arthur, smiled his easy, charming smile. It was the same smile that had won over investors and charmed competitors, a weaponized affability that Arthur now recognized as utterly hollow. "Arthur, thank you for coming," Julian said, his voice as smooth as the aged whiskey in his glass. "It means the world to me." "Let's dispense with the pleasantries, Julian," Arthur replied, his voice a low rumble. "You asked for a meeting. You have it. State your purpose." The waitress arrived with the bread basket, placing it on the table with a quiet reverence. As she leaned in to pour him more water, her sleeve brushed against his hand. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible touch, but he felt something small and sharp-cornered pressed into his palm. His fingers closed around it instinctively. It was a piece of paper, folded into a tight, dense square. He glanced up at her. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, but for a split second, Her dark eyes met his, and he saw a flicker of raw, undiluted fear. She gave a nearly invisible shake of her head, a silent plea, before straightening up and moving away from the table. "As I was saying," Julian continued, oblivious, "I've had a lot of time to think. About what happened. About what I threw away. I was arrogant, Arthur. I was a fool." Arthur's attention was divided. His mind, a finely tuned machine for risk assessment, was now processing two distinct threats. The one sitting across from him, cloaked in false contrition, and the unknown one communicated by the terrified eyes of a young waitress. Beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, his fingers carefully, painstakingly, unfolded the small square of paper. It wasn't a napkin. It was a page torn from a small sketch pad, the paper slightly thicker than usual. The handwriting was a compact, hurried script, written with the graphite of a drawing pencil. "They're not here to talk. It's a trap. Your phone is being cloned. Don't react. Don't move." A cold dread, colder than any boardroom negotiation, washed over him. He had faced threats before, anonymous letters, angry shareholders, the occasional crank. His security detail, led by a former Secret Service agent named Marcus, was waiting discreetly in a sedan across the street. But this note suggested something more insidious, an inside job. "Your phone is being cloned." That meant they weren't after his money, not directly. They were after his data, the lifeblood of his company. Project Nightingale, a revolutionary AI protocol so advanced it would redefine global communication. It was his legacy, the culmination of his life's work, and it existed only on a handful of encrypted servers accessible by a single biometric key. His phone. He risked a glance at the waitress. She was at a nearby station, polishing wine glasses, her back to him. He could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. Who was she? Why was she risking this? In his world, altruism was a myth, a currency for the naive. Everyone had an angle. What was hers? He forced his expression to remain impassive, a granite mask honed over 50 years. He took a slow sip of water, the glass no longer trembling. The fear was still there, a block of ice in his gut. But it was now overlaid with a cold, clear fury. He had been betrayed by the man he'd treated as a son, and now that same man was trying to steal his legacy in the one place Arthur considered a sanctuary. "You've changed, Julian," Arthur said, letting a hint of weary condescension color his tone. It was a role he knew how to play. The aging lion, perhaps a little tired, a little too willing to forgive. Maturity, perhaps. Or failure. It's an excellent teacher. Julian's smile tightened at the edges. "A bit of both. I've started my own consulting firm. Small, but we're making waves. I realized I work better on my own. But I never forgot the lessons you taught me." A lie. Every word, a polished lie. The waitress returned, her movements fluid and silent. She placed a small plate of appetizers between them. As she set it down, she spoke. Her voice, a low, professional murmur, meant only for him. "My name is Clara. The man at the bar, the one on the left, has a signal jammer. Your security can't be reached. The manager, Mr. Dubois, is with them. The back alley is blocked." Each piece of information was a nail hammered into his coffin. Signal jammer, a compromised manager. No easy escape. This wasn't an amateurish snatch and grab. This was a sophisticated, well-planned operation. He looked at Clara, truly looked at her this time. He saw the faint smudge of charcoal on her thumb, the intense focus in her eyes as she scanned the room. Not as a servant, but as a sentinel. She wasn't just a waitress. "Is the food to your liking, Mr. Vance?" she asked, her voice returning to its normal, polite pitch. Her eyes, however, conveyed a different message. They held his for a moment longer than necessary, and in their depths he saw not just fear, but a fierce, stubborn intelligence. "Trust me," they seemed to say. Arthur Vance had not blindly trusted anyone in 3 decades, not since his first partner had sold their designs to a competitor for a pittance. Trust was a liability, an emotional indulgence he could not afford. Yet, faced with the polished treachery of the man he once loved as a son, he found himself considering an alliance with a complete stranger, a girl who probably earned in a week what he spent on a bottle of wine. His mind raced, sifting through the limited, terrible options. If he made a scene, they would likely escalate. If he tried to walk out, they would stop him. If he did nothing, he would lose everything. He was pinned, a king on a chessboard with no valid moves left. His only wild card was the young woman with charcoal on her thumb and terror in her eyes. He needed to know more. He needed to understand her. As she moved to another table, he watched her, cataloguing her every action. She interacted with an elderly couple, her smile genuine and warm. He saw her stoop to pick up a child's dropped crayon, returning it with a soft word that made the little girl beam. Then, at her station, she took out the small order pad and a pencil. For a moment, between tasks, her hand moved with a life of its own, not writing down an order, but sketching. With a few deft economical lines, she captured the haughty expression of a woman at the bar, the weary slump of the busboy. It was a small, private act, but it spoke volumes. She was an observer, an artist. Her world was one of details, of nuances of expression and posture that others missed. That's how she'd seen it. She hadn't overheard a clumsy conversation. She had read the situation in their tightened jaws, their watchful eyes, the subtle tells of men who were hunting. This wasn't a random act of kindness from a concerned citizen. This was the result of a specific, honed skill. The realization didn't make him trust her completely, but it made her credible. Her warning wasn't born of panic, but of observation. Julian was still talking, weaving a web of remorse and future promise. And that's why I wanted to propose a joint venture, a way to merge my new agility with the resources of Vance Industries, a way to put the past behind us, for good. It was the pretext, the Trojan horse. While Arthur was meant to be distracted by this ludicrous, insulting proposal, the technical part of the trap would be sprung. He subtly shifted in his seat, his hand hovering near his jacket pocket, where he kept a small, custom-made satellite phone, a last resort for emergencies, likely useless against a military-grade jammer, but a comfort nonetheless. Clara was approaching again, this time with a bottle of wine and a sommelier's corkscrew. She moved with a new sense of purpose. As she passed the bar, she seemed to stumble slightly, her arm brushing against a decorative stand holding a large, ornate silver platter. The platter wobbled precariously. The 2 men at the bar flinched, one reaching out instinctively to steady it. For a fraction of a second, their attention was diverted. It was all the time she needed. She reached his table, her back to the bar, and began the ritual of presenting the wine. "Chateau Margaux, 1982, she said, her voice smooth and professional. But under her breath, so low it was barely a vibration in the air, she added, "Reflection. The silver platter. I saw his phone screen. It wasn't a menu. It was a schematic of your building's server room. They have a cloning device under their table, a black briefcase. They're waiting for you to use your phone to authorize the wine payment. That's the trigger." It all clicked into place. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle. The wine was a prop. The payment was the key. They would have him use his phone's tap-to-pay feature, and in that moment of transaction, the nearby device would capture the biometric handshake and clone his phone's unique security identifier. Within seconds, they would have access to Project Nightingale. He looked from Clara's pale, determined face to Julian's expectant smile. The boyish charm was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian patience. He was waiting. The trap was set, the bait was on the table, and the steel jaws were ready to snap shut. Arthur Vance, the titan of industry, the man who controlled the flow of information for a quarter of the globe, was cornered. His empire, his entire legacy, now rested on the courage of a 20-year-old waitress with a sketch pad and eyes that saw too much, and he had to make a choice, play the victim or trust the artist. The silence at the table stretched, thin and taut. Julian's smile remained fixed, but a flicker of impatience danced in his eyes. He gestured towards the wine Clara was holding. "A fine year, Arthur. A toast to new beginnings?" Arthur felt the weight of Clara's gaze. It was a silent, urgent question. He had to give her a signal, some indication that he understood, that he was with her. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of weariness that he hoped looked genuine. As he did, he met her eyes and gave a slow, deliberate blink. "I understand." "What now?" Her response was immediate, communicated in the barest whisper as she leaned forward with the corkscrew. "The fire alarm, by the kitchen doors. It's an old system, manual pull. If it's pulled, the emergency protocols kick in. Magnetic locks on the main doors release, but the kitchen exit, which leads to the service corridor, opens onto a different street. They won't expect that. They're watching the front and the alley." It was a plan born of desperation, but also of intimate knowledge. She didn't just work here. She paid attention. She knew the building's eccentricities, its weaknesses. "When I pour the wine," she breathed, her hand steady as she uncorked the bottle, "create a distraction. A big one. Something they can't ignore. I'll handle the alarm." A distraction. He looked around the hushed dining room. The other patrons were islands of blissful ignorance, lost in their food and conversations. A big distraction would turn this quiet sanctuary into a scene of chaos. People could get hurt. But the alternative, letting Julian win, letting his life's work be stolen, was unthinkable. "Julian," Arthur said, his voice firm, drawing the younger man's full attention. "Before we toast, there's something I need to show you." He reached for his phone on the table. He saw the subtle shift in Julian's posture, the way his associate at the bar leaned forward, almost imperceptibly. The predators were ready. Arthur unlocked the phone with his thumbprint, his screen lighting up. He navigated to his photo gallery, feigning a search. "It's a picture of my granddaughter," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with what he hoped sounded like grandfatherly pride. "She just started kindergarten." He watched Julian's face. The feigned interest was almost perfect, but Arthur could see the ravenous hunger behind the mask. He was so close. Clara began to pour the deep red liquid into his glass. The rich aroma filled the air. It was the signal. Arthur's hand, the one holding the multi-$1,000 phone, suddenly spasmed. He let out a sharp cry, a mixture of pain and surprise, and knocked his arm against the table. The heavy crystal water glass teetered for a moment before crashing to the floor, shattering with a sound like a gunshot in the silent room. At the exact same instant, with a movement born of calculated fury, he swept his other arm across the table, sending the bread basket, appetizer plates, and Julian's full glass of whiskey flying. The effect was instantaneous. A woman at the next table screamed. Diners twisted in their seats, their faces a mixture of shock and alarm. Julian, splattered with whiskey and bread rolls, stared at him, his charming facade finally cracking to reveal the raw anger beneath. "What the hell, Arthur?" he snarled. But Arthur wasn't looking at him. He was looking at Clara. In the bedlam he had created, she was a blur of motion. She hadn't run for the alarm. She had done something far more brilliant. Instead of heading for the wall, she had grabbed the wobbling silver platter from its stand. With a strength that belied her slender frame, she swung it like a discus, not at a person, but at the towering, glass-fronted wine cabinet that stood against the far wall. The sound of the heavy silver platter hitting hundreds of bottles of priceless wine was apocalyptic. It wasn't a crash, it was an explosion of glass and liquid. A tidal wave of red and white wine, mixed with glittering shards, cascaded across the floor. The sheer, shocking violence of the act stunned everyone into silence for a second, even Julian's men. That second was all she needed. As the room stared at the destruction, she darted, low and fast, towards the kitchen doors. She didn't just pull the alarm. She grabbed the heavy steel fire extinguisher from its mounting on the wall. With a grunt of effort, she aimed the nozzle not at a fire, but directly at the two men at the bar. A thick, billowing cloud of white chemical foam erupted from the extinguisher, engulfing them completely. They shouted in shock and confusion, blinded and disoriented. The fine powder would ruin their expensive suits, but more importantly, it would instantly disable any electronic equipment they were carrying. The signal jammer, the cloning device. "Now!" Clara screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. Arthur didn't hesitate. He shoved the table with all his strength, sending it crashing into a stunned Julian. He sprinted for the kitchen doors, his aging knees protesting but his adrenaline-fueled will overriding the pain. He heard shouts behind him. The manager, Mr. Dubois, yelling, "Stop him! Grab him!" He burst through the swinging doors into the bright, chaotic world of the kitchen. Chefs and dishwashers stared, frozen in place. Clara was already there, holding a heavy steel door open. It led into a dark, narrow service corridor that smelled of bleach and old grease. "This way! It leads to 68th Street!" she yelled. They plunged into the corridor just as one of Julian's men, wiping foam from his eyes, stumbled into the kitchen after them. The door slammed shut behind them. It was a fire door. It locked automatically. They were safe for the moment. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the narrow concrete passage. Arthur could hear the frantic pounding on the door behind them. The corridor twisted, and then he saw it, a slice of night sky, and the blessed, beautiful sight of a streetlight at the far end. They burst out onto the street, gasping for the cool night air. It was a different world from the polished elegance of the restaurant's main entrance. Here there were dumpsters and the low hum of industrial ventilation fans. Arthur fumbled for his real phone, the one he kept in his inner jacket pocket. His fingers, slick with sweat, struggled with the screen. He dialed Marcus's number. "Marcus, code red, 68th Street, service exit of the Gilded Cage. They're inside. Lock the building down. No one in or out." He could hear Marcus's calm, professional voice on the other end, already issuing orders. Within moments, the street would be swarming with his security team, and shortly after, the NYPD. He leaned against the cold brick wall, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at Clara. She was trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The front of her white shirt was stained with a splash of red wine, like a wound. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing with a defiant, brilliant light. You destroyed their equipment," he said, his voice filled with a sense of awe that was entirely foreign to him. "The fire extinguisher." She nodded, still catching her breath. "CO2 extinguishers," she said, her voice shaky but clear. They shoot out a cloud of frozen carbon dioxide, the thermal shock and the static discharge. It fries unshielded microelectronics. I read about it in a tech journal. I hoped it would work. Arthur stared at her. It wasn't a random act of panic. It was a calculated, intelligent move based on something she had read. She had seen the problem, diagnosed the threat, and deployed a solution using the only tools available to her: her knowledge of the restaurant's layout and a piece of obscure technical information she had filed away in her brain. She hadn't just saved him. She had outsmarted them. He thought of the hundreds of engineers he employed, the brilliant minds with advanced degrees from the world's top universities. And in this moment of ultimate crisis, his entire $50 billion empire had been saved by a 20-year-old art student who paid attention to the world around her. Clara, he said, the name feeling solid and real on his tongue. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, offering it to her. I believe I owe you my life and my legacy. She looked at the clean, monogrammed square of linen, then back at his face. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, and he could see the shock setting in. Her body began to shake more violently. Tears welled in her eyes, not of fear anymore, but of release. I couldn't let them do that, she whispered, her voice cracking. It wasn't right. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. The cavalry was coming, but the battle, the real battle, had already been won. It had been won in a quiet corner booth, with a folded piece of paper and a shared look of understanding. It had been won in a hail of chemical foam and shattered glass. It had been won by a young woman who saw the world not just as it was, but in all its intricate, dangerous, and beautiful detail. Arthur Vance looked at the city lights blurring around him and knew, with absolute certainty, that his life had just been irrevocably changed. The trap had been set for him, but in the end it had been Julian who was caught, and it was Arthur who had finally, after so many years, been set free. The aftermath was a controlled storm. Within minutes, the service alley was flooded with the quiet professionals of Arthur's security team and the louder, more official presence of the NYPD. The gilded cage was sealed, its wealthy patrons transformed from diners into witnesses. Julian Croft and his 2 associates, still sputtering and covered in chemical dust and fine wine, were apprehended without further incident. The compromised manager, Mr. Dubois, folded under the first hint of pressure, his obsequious nature ill-suited for genuine criminal resolve. Arthur and Clara were whisked away to a waiting armored sedan, insulated from the flashing lights and shouting reporters who had descended upon the scene like vultures. Inside the car, the silence was thick. Clara sat huddled against the door, staring out at the passing city lights, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot, sweet tea one of Marcus's men had produced. She was still trembling. Arthur watched her, a maelstrom of thoughts churning in his mind. His initial gratitude was solidifying into a profound sense of responsibility. He had seen her courage, but now he was seeing the cost, the pallor of her skin, the haunted look in her eyes. She hadn't just pulled a fire alarm, she had stared in. The silence inside the armored sedan was a physical presence, heavier than the bulletproof glass that separated them from the screaming city. It was a vacuum, filled only by the whisper of the tires on wet asphalt and the ragged, shallow sound of Clara's breathing. She was huddled against the far door, a small, shivering figure lost in the cavernous leather interior. The fine merino wool blanket one of Marcus's men had draped over her shoulders seemed to offer no warmth, only weight. Her gaze was fixed on the window, but Arthur knew she wasn't seeing the neon-slicked streets of Manhattan. She was seeing shattered glass, a cloud of white chemical foam, the reptilian coldness in Julian Croft's eyes. Arthur Vance sat opposite her, his own body a tightly coiled spring of adrenaline and icy rage. He should have felt relief, victory even. He had won. His legacy, Project Nightingale, was secure. Julian was in custody, but the familiar metallic taste of triumph was absent, replaced by something acrid and unsettling. He felt old. Not just 72 years of age, but a brittle, geological oldness, as if the night's events had compressed decades of stress into a few terrifying hours. He looked at his hands, expecting to see them tremble, but they were rock steady. It was his soul that was shaking. He had built his life on the principle of control. He controlled markets, information, people. He anticipated every variable, hedged against every risk. Tonight, control had been an illusion. He had been a pawn, a target, utterly helpless until this girl, this stranger, had detonated the entire chessboard. He watched her, the artist who had used a silver platter as a weapon and a fire extinguisher as a tactical device. He saw the faint smudge of charcoal still on her thumb, a stark contrast to the smear of red wine on her white shirt that looked so much like blood. It was the mark of her two worlds colliding, the quiet observer and the desperate combatant. "My legal team is meeting us," he said, his voice sounding harsh and alien in the profound quiet. It was the voice he used for hostile board meetings, stripped of all softness. "They will handle everything. You will need to provide a statement. Be precise. Do not embellish. Do not speculate. Stick to the observable facts." Clara didn't turn. A single, crystalline tear traced a path down her cheek, illuminated by a passing street light. "Observable facts," she whispered, the words barely audible. "The observable fact is that he was going to kill you. I saw it in his eyes, after you threw the glass. He wasn't just angry. He was deciding." The simple, terrifying truth of her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had been so focused on the data, the theft of his project, that he had compartmentalized the more primal threat. Julian wouldn't have just taken his phone. A living, breathing Arthur Vance was a witness, a rival who could rebuild. A dead Arthur Vance was a tragic headline, his empire thrown into chaos, ripe for the picking by vultures who had been paid off by his former protégé. The trap wasn't just for his company, it was for his life. And this girl, with her artist's eye for human expression, had seen the final, lethal move before it was made. The car glided to a stop in the subterranean garage of a featureless skyscraper in Midtown. Marcus opened the door, and the sterile, concrete-scented air rushed in. "Sir, we're secure." They were led not to a police station, but to a suite of offices that belonged to Arthur's law firm. It was a world of hushed carpets, polished mahogany, and the faint scent of money. Clara looked even smaller and more fragile here, a field mouse in a lion's den. The lawyers descended, men and women with predatory smiles and eyes that calculated by the billable hour. They treated her with a careful, almost reverent deference, handling her as if she were a priceless, unstable artifact. Arthur watched the process from an adjacent conference room, observing through a one-way glass panel as they gently coaxed a statement from her. He saw her struggle, her hands twisting in her lap. He saw her flinch when a lawyer accidentally dropped a pen on the table, the sharp clatter echoing the sound of the shattering water glass. The trauma was a living thing inside her, and these people, for all their skill, were treating the wound with legal antiseptic instead of human kindness. He felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in years. Protective fury. He strode into the room. "That's enough for tonight," he commanded. The pack of lawyers fell back instantly. He walked over to Clara, who looked up at him with wide, exhausted eyes. "Marcus will take you somewhere safe. A hotel suite. You will rest. We will talk tomorrow." He was offering safety, but his tone was one of dismissal. It was the only way he knew how to operate. He was solving a problem, managing an asset. The asset was traumatized. The solution was rest and security. It was a clinical, logical process. She simply nodded, too drained to argue or question. As Marcus led her out, she paused at the door and looked back at him. "You should know," she said, her voice a thread. "I didn't do it for your company, or your legacy." "Then why?" he asked, the question sharper than he intended. "Because you looked afraid," she said, "when you first read the note. For just a second. You looked like my father did, the day the bank took our house. You looked human." She left. The door clicked shut, leaving Arthur alone in the sterile room, with her words echoing in the silence. You looked human. It felt less like an observation and more like an accusation, a reminder of a self he had buried under 50 years of corporate armor. He had spent a lifetime cultivating an aura of invincibility, only to have it stripped away by a 20-year-old girl who had seen the terrified man behind the myth. The hotel suite was on the 54th floor, a sprawling expanse of beige carpets, anonymous art, and floor-to-ceiling windows that presented New York City as a silent, glittering jewel box. It was a cage, more gilded than the restaurant, but a cage nonetheless. A polite, anonymous woman from the hotel staff had shown Clara the amenities: the rainfall shower, the 1,000-thread-count sheets, the minibar stocked with things she'd never heard of. There was a closet full of clothes in her size, tags still attached, and a bathroom counter laden with expensive toiletries. Arthur Vance's machinery had anticipated her every physical need and catered to it with terrifying efficiency. But as the door closed and she was left alone, an oppressive silence descended. It was the silence that undid her. At her tiny walk-up apartment, there was always noise: the rumble of the subway, the shouts from the street, the hum of her ancient refrigerator. Here, the silence was absolute, a dead weight that pressed in on her. She tried to sketch. It was her anchor, the way she processed the world. She opened the fresh, crisp sketch pad and picked up the perfectly sharpened graphite pencil left for her on the desk. But her hand shook violently. The lines she drew were jagged, frantic things, devoid of meaning. She saw the schematic from the man's phone screen in her mind's eye, the cold geometry of it. She saw the arc of the silver platter as it flew through the air. She heard the symphony of destruction as it hit the wine cabinet, a sound she knew would haunt her dreams. She curled up on the enormous bed, pulling the duvet around her, but the cold was deep inside her bones. Every shadow in the room seemed to menace her. Every creak of the building was a footstep in the hall. They knew who she was. They knew what she'd done. What if Julian had friends? What if they came for her? Arthur Vance's security couldn't be everywhere. Sleep, when it finally came, was no refuge. It was a dark, churning sea of fear. She was back in the restaurant, but the patrons were all mannequins with cold, painted smiles. Julian was there, his face calm as he explained how he was going to dismantle her, piece by piece. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She woke up gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs, the luxurious sheets twisted around her and damp with sweat. The glittering city outside the window seemed to mock her, a beautiful, indifferent monster. She was a ghost haunting someone else's life, and she didn't know how to get back to her own. 2 days later, Arthur sat in his own office, a minimalist eyrie on the 80th floor of the Vance Industries Tower. He was watching the security footage from the gilded cage for the 10th time. He wasn't watching himself or Julian. He was watching Clara. On the silent, grainy screen, he saw what his lawyer's reports and Marcus's debriefs could not convey. He saw the infinitesimal moment she noticed the men at the bar. It wasn't a glance. It was a subtle stiffening of her posture, a fractional pause in her movements. He saw her calculated stumble near the silver platter, a piece of theatre designed to test the men's reactions and grant her a glimpse of the phone screen in the reflection. He saw the quiet, desperate urgency as she scribbled the note, shielding the sketchpad with her body. He saw the moment she decided to escalate, her eyes flicking from the fire alarm to the wine cabinet to the fire extinguisher, a rapid-fire sequence of threat assessment and strategic planning that would have made his best corporate raiders proud. This wasn't a panicked, accidental heroism. It was a masterpiece of improvised intelligence. She hadn't just reacted, she had observed, analyzed, and acted with devastating precision. Marcus stood by the window, his arms crossed. "The girl is a liability, Arthur." "She's a material witness," Arthur corrected, his eyes still glued to the screen. "And a target," Marcus added. Croft wasn't working alone. His financial backers are quiet, powerful people. They won't be happy. The girl is the only loose end not officially connected to you. They could try to silence her, to send a message. Arthur muted the video, the silence of his office rushing back in. "What do you propose?" "We relocate her, give her a new identity, a trust fund. She disappears. It's the cleanest, safest option, for her and for us." It was the logical move, the corporate move. Treat her like a compromised agent in a spy novel. Erase her for her own good. He imagined Clara, her sketchpad, her fierce, intelligent eyes, living under a false name in some anonymous town in Oregon, forever looking over her shoulder. The thought was repulsive. It was a different kind of prison. "No," Arthur said, the word final. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Arthur, this isn't the time for sentiment." "This isn't sentiment," Arthur snapped, turning away from the screen. "It's strategy. Their mistake was underestimating the people they thought were invisible. The waitress. The old man. They saw us as props in their play. If we hide her, we validate their thinking. We confirm that she is a pawn to be removed from the board. I will not do that." He stood up, pacing the length of the vast office. "She is not a liability, Marcus. She is an asset of a kind I've never encountered before. She sees things as they are. She sees the truth. People like that are rare. You don't hide them. You arm them." He stopped and looked at his security chief. "Find out everything about her. Her school, her financial situation, her history, everything. And arrange a meeting. Not here. Not in a hotel. Somewhere neutral." The meeting took place at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was Arthur's choice. He found her, as instructed, in the Greek and Roman sculpture gallery, sitting on a bench and sketching a statue of a wounded warrior. She looked pale and tired, but her hand was steady now. She was drawing with a fierce concentration, as if trying to pull the stoic strength from the marble into herself. She didn't seem surprised to see him. She simply closed her sketchpad and waited. "I apologize for my conduct the other night," he began, forgoing any pleasantries. "I was processing the breach. I can be abrupt." She gave a small, non-committal shrug. "You're a busy man, Mr. Vance." "Arthur," he corrected. "And you are Clara." They walked in silence for a time, their footsteps echoing softly in the cavernous hall. They passed statues of gods and emperors, frozen figures of immense power. It was a fitting backdrop. "I have a proposal for you," he said finally, stopping in front of a glass case containing delicate ancient Roman glass, miraculously preserved. "My team believes you are in danger. They believe the best course of action is for you to disappear. A new life, a new name, financially secure forever. You would never have to worry again." He watched her face carefully. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear, but a deep, weary anger. "You want to put me in a box and store me somewhere safe," she said. It wasn't a question. "Like one of these." She gestured to the glass case, a preserved artifact from a past crisis. "It would be the safest option," he conceded. "Safe is not the same as living," she countered, her voice low but intense. "You of all people should know that. Your whole life has been about risk. Now you want to deny me mine? This isn't a calculated business risk, Clara. This is a threat against your life." "And what was I supposed to do?" She shot back, her dark eyes flashing. "Serve the wine and smile while they dismantled you? While they stole your life's work and maybe your life? I made a choice. I knew there would be consequences. Hiding me away is not protecting me. It's punishing me for that choice. It's telling me I should have just kept my head down and polished the silverware." He was taken aback by her fire. He had expected fear, or at least a weary resignation. He had not expected this proud, unyielding defiance. She was right. His solution, born of a cold, protective logic, was an insult to the very courage he admired. He had seen her as a problem to be managed, and she was refusing to be managed. "What do you want, then?" he asked, his voice softer now, genuinely curious. She took a deep breath, turning to face him fully. "I want my life back, the one I was building. I want to finish my degree. I want to pay my rent in my own apartment. I want to paint the people you're worried about. They win if they scare me into becoming someone else. I won't let them win." He looked at this young woman, so fierce and fragile, standing amidst the ghosts of a fallen empire, and he finally understood. He couldn't give her safety. No one could. But he could give her something else. He could give her a fortress. He could give her weapons. "All right," he said. "No more hiding. We do this your way, but on my terms. You will have a security detail. Discreet, but absolute. They will be your shadow until Marcus is satisfied the threat is neutralized. You will move to a new apartment, one that is secure. Your tuition will be paid. You will also receive a salary from a Vance Industries subsidiary for freelance security consultation. It will be more than enough for rent and supplies. These are my non-negotiable terms." She opened her mouth to protest, the proud artist ready to refuse the billionaire's charity. He held up a hand. "This is not a gift, Clara. This is an investment. I'm investing in your continued ability to see what others miss. Your first consultation assignment is this. Review the security protocols for my personal detail. Read the files, study the patterns, and tell me where the vulnerabilities are. Tell me what my own highly paid experts have missed." He saw the shift in her eyes. He had offered her a job, not a handout. He had given her a purpose within her new, dangerous reality, a way to use her unique skills. He had given her a measure of control. It was a currency she could accept. A slow smile touched her lips for the first time. "All right, Arthur," she said. "You've got a deal." The following year was an education for them both. Clara moved into a secure but unostentatious apartment in the West Village. Two of Marcus's best agents, a man and a woman who could have passed for graduate students, became her near-constant companions. At first it was suffocating, but she learned to incorporate them into the background of her life, like the ever-present hum of the city. She devoured the security files Arthur gave her. She brought her artist's eye to the cold, tactical data. She didn't see patrol routes, she saw patterns and rhythms. She didn't see schematics, she saw lines of sight, blind spots, places where human behavior would override protocol. Her first report was 20 pages long, filled with hand-drawn diagrams and notes in the margins about things like waiter's blind spot and the predictable rhythm of a coffee run. Marcus, initially skeptical, was stunned. She had identified 3 genuine vulnerabilities his team had overlooked for years. Her real work, however, happened in her studio. Freed from the crushing weight of financial worry, her art exploded. She painted with a feverish intensity, channeling the fear and chaos of that night onto the canvas. Her early pieces were dark, abstract, filled with jagged shapes and jarring colors. They were portraits of trauma, raw and unsettling. Arthur would visit her studio once a month. He'd stand before a new canvas, silent, trying to understand a language of color and emotion that was utterly foreign to him. "I don't understand this one," he admitted one afternoon, looking at a canvas that was a chaotic swirl of crimson and black, slashed through with a streak of brilliant, terrifying white. "It's the sound of the wine cabinet breaking," she said simply. "I'm trying to paint the sound." He began to see. He started to look not for a narrative or a recognizable image, but for the feeling. He saw her fear, her anger, her resilience, all laid bare. He was accustomed to data streams and financial reports, clean, sterile numbers that told a story of profit and loss. Her paintings were the opposite, a messy, complex, and profoundly human data stream that told a story of survival. Their friendship solidified in these quiet studio visits. It was an odd, asymmetrical bond. He was the benefactor, the protector. But she was the teacher, the one who was reintroducing him to the world of nuance and emotion he had long since abandoned. She became his moral compass, the quiet question in the back of his mind whenever he was about to make a ruthless business decision. What would Clara see here? Meanwhile, the legal gears turned. Julian Croft, facing an avalanche of evidence, took a plea deal. He would serve 15 years in a federal prison. His backers, as Marcus predicted, remained shadows, their names never surfacing in the proceedings. The threat to Clara slowly faded from an active danger to a low, background hum of caution. One day, Arthur arrived at the studio to find her standing before a massive new canvas, the largest he'd ever seen her work on. It was different from her other pieces. It was not abstract. It was terrifyingly real. It was the scene in the restaurant. For months, he watched it take shape. He saw her painstakingly render the blood-red leather of the booth, the gleam of the silverware, his own face, weary and trapped. She labored most over Julian's face, scraping the paint away and restarting a dozen times, trying to capture the perfect, chilling emptiness behind his charming smile. She became an investigator of memory, using her art to dissect the most traumatic moment of her life and reclaim it. 18 months after the night at the Gilded Cage, the painting was finished. It was the centerpiece of her first solo exhibition in a prestigious Soho gallery, an event Arthur had funded, but that her talent had earned. The gallery was buzzing, a microcosm of the New York art world. Critics and collectors moved through the space, speaking in low, appreciative tones. Arthur ignored them all, making his way to the far wall where the painting hung. It was titled simply, "A Toast to New Beginnings." Seeing it finished, under the stark gallery lights, was like a physical shock. She had captured it all, the opulence and the menace, the silent communication, the precipice of violence. Her own face was in shadow, a deliberate choice, making her the anonymous, observing every woman. But the focal point, the dead center of the masterpiece, was the reflection in the polished silver wine bucket on the table. In its distorted, convex surface, the entire drama was mirrored: a tiny, trapped Arthur, a looming, predatory Julian, and the glint of a phone screen displaying its cold, blue-white light. It was a story of betrayal and salvation, told in a single, captured instant. He felt a hand slide into his. It was Clara. She was radiant, dressed in a simple dark blue dress, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and nervous energy. "What do you think?" she whispered. He was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the reflection in the painted wine bucket. He saw himself as she had seen him. Not a titan of industry, but a frightened old man, a human being. "I think," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name, "that you have created a masterpiece. But more than that, you've shown me the truth." He finally turned to look at her, the young artist whose world he had entered to protect her, but who had, in turn, saved him from a prison of his own making, a gilded cage of power and isolation. "That night, Julian tried to steal my future," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He thought my legacy was an AI protocol on a server. He was a fool. This," he said, gesturing to the painting, to the entire gallery filled with her soul, to her standing beside him, "this is my legacy. Not the company I built, but the artist I was lucky enough to meet." The trap had been set for him, a complex mechanism of technology and greed, but its ultimate result had been to free two people, a young woman who found her voice in the aftermath of terror, and an old man who, after a lifetime of looking at the world, was finally beginning to see.